Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. My colleagues are Karen Aram and Ed Mandel. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, September 5th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism against people in foreign countries, encouraged sotto voce by our government as an excuse, not the reason, for their wars. At this moment, the U.S. is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, and threatening to attack North Korea. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The following is from the American playwright C.J. Hopkins on the Counterpunch website. The poets often get there first. Sometime around late July, as the hundreds of thousands of de facto vassals that cater the needs of New York City's simulated aristocracy were navigating the sweltering hell that subway system has recently become, approximately 100 miles to the east, deep in the heart of the resistance territory, he's referring to the Hamptons on the east end of Long Island, where villas rent for up to $1 million a month, members of the notorious Bridgehampton Cell of the Neoliberal Liberation Army were gathered in one of their luxury safe houses, vetting the latest leading candidate for the coveted position of resistance leader. Resistance he's referring to is resistance to the Trump administration, basically made up of the defeated Clinton campaign. California Senator Kamala Harris, multimillionaire woman of the people and friend of rapacious banks like One West, must have impressed the Bridgehampton Cell, because their comrades in corporate-owned media immediately launched a propaganda campaign to get the word out to the American people, who have been suffering under occupation for 7 months since Trump's inauguration, that the senator and her affluent backers represent their last best hope of overthrowing the Trumpian Reich and saving the world from the Putin Nazis. For those unfamiliar with the Putin Nazis, it's an official term I recently made up to describe not just the Russian Federation and Vladimir Putin and his inner circle, but also the maleficent global alliance of Russian hackers, Russian propagandists, Russian diplomats, Russian business persons, persons married to Russian persons, persons with Russian-sounding names, neo-Nazis, alt-right geeks, Goldman Sachs guys, Sandinistas, Corbynistas, former coal miners, hillbilly oxycodone addicts, socialists, anarchists, Black Lives Matterists, and the ghost of George Carlin, the ACLU, and anyone who has ever retweeted WikiLeaks or didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. As I'm sure you recall, the Putin Nazis originally materialized out of thin air around the time that Clinton was managing to lose the U.S. presidential election to a repulsive, jabbering, narcissistic clown with absolutely no political experience, who the mainstream media had been assuring the world for months was the second coming of Hitler. Given that it was virtually impossible for Clinton to lose to such an noxious buffoon, the only rational explanation was the Russians had somehow hacked the election, or interfered with, or influenced the election. They'd done this by getting their hands on a batch of internal democratic emails, passing them on to Putin Nazi propaganda minister Julian Assange, who published them on the internet, where they were read by former Obama voters who were so completely shocked by their contents that they decided not to vote for Clinton, as they had obviously been intending to do, until their minds got interfered with. The rest, as they say, is history. On January 20th, despite the fact that everyone knew that the entire Trump family were Putin Nazi sleeper agents, and that the man himself was the glorious leader of an underground army of neo-Nazis numbering the tens of hundreds that was threatening the very fabric of democracy by circulating cartoon frogs on the internet, Donald J. Trump was sworn in as president, and the Trumpian Reich officially began. Fortunately, Americans are not a bunch of camembert slurping surrender monkeys. Although the ruling establishment was bound by law to allow a neo-fascist dictator who was clearly working for a hostile foreign power to move his circus into the White House, they were hardly going to sit idly by and watch as he transformed America into some sort of neo-nationalist dystopia, where grade school children would be forced to learn Russian, Hitler salute the Confederate flag, and whatever other Russo-Nazi horrors he and Steve Bannon had in mind. Before Trump could even order the removal of every likeness of Martin Luther King from the D.C. metropolitan area, the Democratic Party, patriotic Republicans, the intelligence community, the corporate-owned media, and of course just millions of good Americans launched a grassroots resistance movement to remove him from office by any means necessary. 7 months later, here we are with a special counsel and a D.C. grand jury who will certainly be able to find something on Trump, or at least ensure that he spends the rest of his term denying the stream of allegations, rumors, and leaks that will flow therefrom. Which means it's time to start getting ready for the day when our national nightmare is over, and Kamala Harris, or whichever royal figurehead the ruling classes ultimately choose, marches through Washington like Charles de Gaulle, presumably with the Obamas and Clintons in tow, after which the USA can continue to bomb, occupy, sanction, and otherwise destabilize various other countries, allow its banks to debt enslave its citizens, maintain a brutal militarized police force, and everything else it's doing at the moment, but in a normal, liberal, non-fascist manner, and Steve Colbert can go back to comedy. Now, to pull this off, the resistance is going to need to deal with these Putin Nazis, specifically the Putin Nazis on the left, who are already tweeting fake news tweets, impugning the character of Senator Harris, who happens to be black and a woman, by the way. Not that that has anything to do with anything, of course. And reminding Americans how they got bamboozled by Obama's hope and change routine. These people need to be de-Putin Nazified, and they need to be de-Putin Nazified immediately. The last thing the resistance needs at this point is to go through all the trouble of regime-changing Trump, only to have Americans elect some other non-vetted, narcissistic billionaire who thinks it might be fun to run for president. This de-Putin Nazification program is going to involve a concerted effort on the part of the entire neoliberal establishment to stigmatize anyone who voted for Trump, or who didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, or who questions the integrity of Kamala Harris, who, as I may have already mentioned, is black, as a bug-eyed, Sieg-heiling Putin Nazi. These people are going to need to be shamed, guilt-tripped, and otherwise emotionally manipulated into keeping their Putin Nazi mouths shut. This isn't going to work on your actual fascists, but it will work on nearly everyone else, or at least on those Obama voters who didn't turn out for Hillary Clinton, and those bitter white Bernie bros who voted for Trump as personal FY to the Democratic Party. See, odd as this is going to sound, the majority of your Putin Nazis don't see themselves as Putin Nazis. They see themselves, well, as just regular Americans who have lost all faith in the electoral system and who believe they're living in a sham republic controlled by global corporations and obscenely wealthy individuals who couldn't care less about them and their families, and whose only allegiance is to a transnational class of corporatist leeches like themselves. Still, despite their cynical beliefs, most of these folks are not particularly fond of being likened to Nazis, racists, or xenophobes, or useful idiots. So this is exactly what the resistance is doing, and intends to keep doing for the next few years. That is, calling their detractors bad names, basically, so that any anti-corporatist dissent that they can't get Google to make disappear with an anti-fake news logarithm can be stigmatized as racist, misogynist, or some other variation of deplorable. Now, they need our help to make this work. Yes, even Counterpunch readers can contribute to this vital effort. Don't worry about the Russian hysteria. The corporate-owned media will take care of that. You want to focus on the fascism aspect and the racism, misogyny, and xenophobia stuff, which is always the best way to silence other leftists. Here are a few simple things you can do. 1. Exaggerate the neo-fascist threat. You can do this on Twitter and Facebook endlessly. Forget about the fact that the number of actual fascists in America is ridiculously small, and the odds of some sort of fascist takeover of the U.S. government are infinitesimal. Convince your friends and Twitter followers that the fascists are on the verge of launching a national fascist revolution. Tweet about their leaders as if they were actual players on the national political stage and not just a handful of pathetic creeps parading around in their Hitler hairdos for 200 or 300 other such creeps. The point here is to help the resistance keep folks' attentions on the fascists and the racists, misogynists, xenophobes and all, and not on the global capitalist elites and the vast transnational corporations that currently control most Western governments. 2. What else you can do? Hammer the identity politics. Do not miss an opportunity to call out anyone who accidentally writes, speaks, or otherwise disseminates a word or phrase that oppresses anyone or that displays any type of unacknowledged privilege. Not only will this help the resistance keep folks divided into an ever-increasing number of powerless little subgroups that pose no threat to the corporate ruling classes, it will feel really good to self-righteously hector anyone whose values are different from yours, especially members of the working classes who couldn't afford to go to university and learn about intersectionality and so on. These folks are virtually fascists anyway. What difference does it make if you alienate them? 3. Now this one is absolutely crucial. Keep comparing Trump to Hitler. If you don't have time for the other two, at least you can help the resistance with this one. See, it's really important that folks believe that Trump is not just a random bozo who rode a wave of populist anger and distrust of the Democrats into the White House, who's now in the process of being neutralized by the people who actually run the country. He needs to be seen as a powerful dictator who at any moment is liable to start, well, killing the Jews or something. Plus, this dovetails with the other 2 points. Exaggerating the fascist threat works much better when you have a powerful Hitler figure you can wag your finger at. And given that Trump is actually a bigot and a misogynist pig and a xenophobe, or at least he plays one on TV, you can have a field day with the identity politics. So go hard on the Hitler stuff, any kind of German references you can think of. Spell his name Drumpf, or call him Herr Trump, or put a little Hitler mustache on him. Don't worry about getting chastised by intersectionalist purity freaks. These kinds of slurs are perfectly acceptable, because as every good American knows, the Germans are, and always will be, Nazis. These are just a few ideas to get started with. I'm sure you can think up some more of your own. The main thing is to steer well clear of any kind of political analysis that reminds folks about the corporatocracy or how much it costs to get elected to office and where the majority of that money comes from, and thus how irrelevant electoral politics is. Oh, and keep an eye out for those Putin Nazis. You never know where they're going to turn up, and I'd hate to see your mind get interfered with. That's from C.J. Hopkins, an award-winning American playwright, novelist, and satirist based in Berlin. That's published on the Counterpunch website. The editor of the Counterpunch website says that he doesn't dare publish satire during the week anymore. He only publishes it on weekends, because when he publishes it during the week, everybody takes it seriously. The piece that I just read clearly is a sharp and swingeing satirist piece about the resistance, the political establishment, the combination of the various elements that Hopkins refers to in his article. There's a lot of news of U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which is dominated by Putin fascists, I guess, the pro-war U.S. political establishment. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making. As I say, we'll try to give a better account tonight. beginning with Karen Aram, who wrote a specific list of what should be done about North Korea this week. I posted that on Facebook and got a large number of approving responses. Points up how little is being said with the administration's fear campaign about North Korea, about what actually should be done in regard to North Korea. And you made a point of saying that, right?
Well, I made a point, as you have, Carl, as we know many people have, but you won't hear it from the mainstream media,
Exactly.
That's for certain. And that is number one. If we really don't want nuclear war with North Korea or China, who has now come out, you know, they have a very, they're military, they're always ready and willing to go to war if necessary, but they have come out now and said under no circumstances will we have war or nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula. China knows this is all about China, not really North Korea.
That is the crucial point.
That's a very crucial point. And this dates back to the 50s, which, Carl, I'm going to come back to you later. I'm hoping you will go into more detail about the actual Korean War. What I know today is that we never actually had an end to that war.
That's right.
We have an armistice, which, again, I hope you'll go into an explanation as to why that's not the end of the war. But what I've discovered of late is that between, I think it was 1993 and 2002, there was an agreement, though, between North Korea and the U.S. not to, that North Korea would freeze their nuclear reactors. And the U.S. agreed then to supply water reactors to North Korea.
Right.
But the U.S. was hoping that the Korean regime would collapse and that they wouldn't have to keep their commitment. And since 2003, I think that they have reneged on some of that, and as a result, little Kim Jong-un, and even before him, Kim Jong-il, did whatever they could to get our attention. Now, freezing nuclear missiles or whatever they're developing, come on, people. Everybody, not just North Korea, but everybody's aware of what happened to those nations that chose not to be nuclear nations. Libya, Iraq, they were totally destroyed, and we see the destruction now of Syria. Would we have attempted what we did had they been nuclear nations?
This is a crucial point.
But keep in mind, China is a nuclear nation. Russia is a nuclear nation. And we have been pushing South Korea to implement THAAD. I think I'm saying that correctly. It's spelled THAAD. And it's supposed to be surveillance, more about surveillance, but it has the opportunity to create, let's just say, create problems for China and Russia, because they're pointed at China, and they're pointed to there's one small section pointed on the tip of Russia, but they're supposed to be, they're going into South Korea, and they're supposed to be focused on that very dangerous North Korea. The point I'm trying to get at is there are ways to prevent nuclear war, and we, the United States, needs to take action rather than provocate war, okay? One is we need to remove our more than 28,000 troops on the border of North Korea that we have in South Korea. I mean, does anybody recognize that those are 28,000 Americans that would die if there was a nuclear war? They would all be dead within 24 hours, as well as most of the people of South Korea, and Seoul would be decimated. That's how long it would take, less than 24 hours. And South Korea, they have a new leader as of, I think it was February, maybe it was April, yes. Anyway, even South Korea is concerned, very concerned. The people have been demonstrating against what the U.S. is attempting to do, but now the leader is starting to recognize that with Trump's rhetoric and provocations to war, that who's going to suffer the most? South Korea. And as we know now, China is just saying, no way, this is going to happen. So what we need to do if we really want peace is to remove those 28,000 troops from the border, bring our troops home. We need to stop our military exercises with the South Koreans in that whole area, the South China Sea, and we even, we stimulate activities, we simulate activities that would be, we actually call it beheading the leader of North Korea, as if that would change anything.
Decapitation, exactly.
Decapitation. And I think we actually simulated the dropping of an atomic bomb on North Korea, but I'm not clear on that.
I think you're right. I think it included
yeah,
that.
yeah, and that was quite recent. So
these are war games.
These
as
are
they
war
say.
games,
Yes,
they call them, right?
What a
but
game.
Just imagine if Russia or China or Korea, North Korea was doing that in the Gulf of Mexico on
This is a crucial
on the
point.
coast of San Francisco or on the borders of Canada. Now, so what we need to do is to end the war. We need to withdraw our troops. We need to, I think we need to provide reparations. And the water reactors probably was supposed to be part of what North Korea was hoping for. And I forgot the other things that I said, Carl, online, on Facebook.
yeah, it was very good.
I forget what else I said, yes.
And you made the crucial points here. The reason China has suggested what they call the double freeze is that they say, okay, we'll convince North Korea to stop their nuclear arms development on the grounds that the U.S. and South Korea will stop these exercises, these war games that you're talking about, which North Korea quite reasonably sees as a threat to them. This is a double freeze, says China. You know, that's fine. We'll do that. We'll suggest that. That would be a way out, and it would be a way out. And what is not mentioned often is that North Korea, which is mainly the North Korean government, which is mainly an object of fun, dangerous, deadly fun in the American press, the North Korean government offered such an arrangement to both the Obama and Trump administrations.
Yes.
That is, that they would freeze their nuclear development in exchange for an end to the war games, the provocative military movements by the U.S. and South Korea. North Korea offered that, and the Obama administration turned them down. North Korea offered that, and the Trump administration turned them down. So the notion that the U.S. is somehow on the point of launching a nuclear war to deal with a Korean madman is not a reasonable description of the situation at all. A reasonable situation of the regional description of the situation would go back, as you suggest, to the Korean War itself, which has always been highly propagandized in the American accounts, and talk about the real situation of North Korea today and the possibility of an extremely dangerous misunderstanding because of the degree of propaganda surrounding the discussion. Your original list, which got such favorable comment, was first, bring the troops home, as you just described. Second, stop the U.S. South Korea military exercises and provocations. Well, points 1 and 2 are the double freeze that China is asking for. 3, end the Korean War, which you also described, which devastated and paralyzed their nation during the 1950s. There's only an armistice. If anything, we owe them reparations for the death and destruction we wrought. That's quite right. Most Americans have no idea how vastly destructive the Korean War was, much less an idea of how it came about. But in fact, the U.S. dropped more bombs on Korea, on North Korea, between 1950 and 53 than it had used in the entire Pacific War against Japan. It was and included bombing the dikes that constrained the floods that devastated North Korea, something everyone recognized as a war crime, even at the time. The point, as General Curtis LeMay said at the time, they ran out of targets to kill in North Korea. They simply had to kill more and more civilians until the Koreans got the idea. Your point 4 was dismantle THAAD. And this is important. THAAD is actually the name is interesting. It was originally called the Theater High Altitude Area Defense.
Right.
And they changed the name from Theater High Altitude Area Defense, the U.S. changed it, to Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. Whom do you think they were trying to scare with that?
Right.
The point is that this is built as a defensive weapon. It defends against the ICBMs. It defends against missiles coming from someplace else. In fact, it's a first strike weapon. A first strike weapon that prevents the deterrence that you were talking about. If your enemy has a nuclear weapon that they can use as a deterrent, if you neutralize that nuclear weapon, the deterrent disappears. And that's what the U.S. has been trying to do for the reasons, as you point out, that there are thousands of American troops, to say nothing of South Korean civilians, within the reach of even conventional weapons from North Korea. The only way in which the U.S. could launch an attack on North Korea would be to neutralize the deterrent weapons, nuclear and non-nuclear, that North Korea has. That's what THAD is supposed to do. And that's pointed out by the people who are most involved with it. And in addition, the weapon itself involves an immense spying capacity that the Chinese point out. Look at a map. You're spying on us.
Right.
You're not just spying on North Korea, which indeed is the case. So your fifth point is get U.S. warships out of the South China Sea. It is the South China Sea, not the Gulf of Mexico or the coast of California. Absolutely right. And remember, this is also the Trump administration, something the Trump administration inherited from the Clinton administration, it was the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, but Clinton, as Secretary of State, was the person who pushed for the militarization of the South China Sea in order to, quote, deter China, close quote. Yeah. So you pointed out that the Korean policy rests in a settled American policy of provocations of China. That's what's really at stake here. And if we actually go back and talk about the history of the Korean War all those years ago and what the U.S. was doing, we suddenly realize that the U.S., America's consistent Asian policy for generations has been to prevent the economic integration of Eurasia, and the Korean War was a step in that based on local conditions, as indeed the Vietnam War was. So to put these things into context and see the continuity of American policy and the risks that American policymakers are willing to run, risks not to them, of course, but to the people of North and South Korea, is to realize that this dangerous situation we find ourselves in today is American-made. And that it's up to the American people to demand that the war provocations, to say nothing of war itself, be off the agenda for the United States.
Yeah, I think it's very important, Carl, that you have often pointed out that historians understand, not all, but some good historians, understand that this goes back to the turn of the century. I think it's Alex McKinder, talked about it in the late 1800s about the importance of Eurasia. Then we had George McKinnon talking about it in 1948, I believe it was. George Kennan in 1948. And we know that... And
one of your favorites, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was the carrier of this doctrine.
He carried it on in 1994 or 97, I've forgotten when he published his book, what's the name of his book again now? It's escaped me. But when you read the works of these people, you see how this has been the plan all along, and it makes no difference whether we have a Republican administration or a Democrat administration. The foreign policy of containment of Eurasia will continue. And the fear of nuclear war, I believe, is going to have an impact on all of the Southeast nations, and I'm hoping that it does, and that they will withdraw their support for the U.S. Warmongering and recognize that China is offering development and prosperity with the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative.
You're watching Aware on the Air. Carl Estabrook, Karen Aram, and Ed Mandel talking about the situation, particularly in Asia at the moment, and the policies our principal concern, the war policies of the United States government. Our friend Ed Mandel has been uncharacteristically quiet, mainly because we've been talking. But you got a chance now.
Well, I'll keep my remarks rather short because I'm not going to approach it. I am going to approach this situation from a different angle. But I will echo first of all that one person mentioned that the size of Korea, no, at least I don't know the entire the nation of Korea, but the North Korea is about the size of Pennsylvania, which shows you how tiny it is. Because so when they say they did nuclear testing in one part of Korea, North Korea, I mean that is rather major, even if it was an underground test. I mean, whatever it is, but that is rather significant.
It's like the Poconos, huh?
Well, it's sort of like, I mean, in the United States, obviously we had our tests all the way off in New Mexico and Nevada, whereas I mean, so I'm just trying to point out.
And we had what, 3,000 of them, and the North Koreans have had 6.
Yes, I won't. That's well. What can I say? And I will say, first of all, I would like to thank you for reading C.J. Hopkins. That was rather interesting. Even though it was a satire, I found myself.
I will say I'll post that on the Facebook page for Aware. He's had 2 follow-up pieces that our friends at Counterpunch have published since that piece, and I'll put them there too. So.
The only thing he missed was I would add an Antifa to the list of fascists.
Oh no, he wrote about it. That's the follow-up article. Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah, that's a teapot tempest, or a tea party tempest, maybe.
Oh boy!
The crucial issues are the ones I think we've been talking about today.
Okay, as a Trump supporter, and I suppose I support Trump generally. I don't support every single down the line there, but generally, what I appreciate about Trump as compared to previous presidents is I believe his ability to think outside the box, and I believe there is a certain amount of thinking outside the box there, where he's, for instance, he's tweeting and he's trying to circumnavigate the media by tweeting directly and to a certain degree, I interpret this as being transparency, but you could also interpret it as being he's just speaking off the cuff, and perhaps he should be much more reserved in his comments. But I appreciate personally, I appreciate his thinking ability to think outside the box, which I think is important because I believe he might be able to more able than previous presidents to find solutions that are outside the box. And whether you two would agree with that, I assume that box would be a coffin. I don't know, but I'm saying I'm optimistic that he will be much more in line with what Eisenhower said in his farewell speech than in previous presidents who disregarded it and any aspect of it intended to go along with the previous administrations, just go along with the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, don't you think though that the problem here is not what Trump himself decides or says or thinks? I've pointed out here that he had a lot of things to say during the campaign, that he was the first major party candidate in 40 years who actually criticized the neoconservative and neoliberal principles that have guided all recent administrations, the principles that brought us more war and more inequality. He criticized that, and that was a large part of what made him president.
Yeah.
But I think what's happened most recently is that he has become increasingly irrelevant to the actions of this administration. Right. That, to our amazement, Trump in office turns out to be about the weakest president since Calvin Coolidge.
Well,
and that the direction of American policy, particularly on the war question, as we've been talking about tonight, are in the hands of a group of generals, a military junta, beginning with the Chief of Staff John Kelly, and including the Defense Secretary Mattis, Mad Dog Mattis, and the National Security Advisor.
Well, I was going to actually mention that because, I don't completely disagree with you. I still think that there's a certain amount of strength there that you apparently don't see. But I do agree with you that right now he's surrounded by generals.
His policies have turned 180 degrees.
I do recognize that. Well, I do recognize the fact that he is surrounded by generals. Most of his advisors are either generals or military-minded.
Right.
And
he's given up to them.
I was going to mention here about the fact that I was hoping that Obama of all people would create something called the Secretary of Peace, and that's something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Dennis Kucinich was.
Well, no, I wasn't even going to go there, but
but he originally. push that?
Well, did he? I'm sorry. I didn't. But I was kind of hoping that something would have been created, or he would create it, because obviously someone like that would be much more conducive to seeing problems from a different perspective than just the line of generals, whatever it is.
If any of the cabinet members now could even possibly be called a Secretary of Peace, in terms of their current jobs, there are two unlikely figures here. It's Attorney General Sessions, that monument to that living monument to the Confederacy, as a friend of ours calls him.
Well.
He is the one who's saying, look, we weren't elected to expand the wars. He's actually the peace voice in this administration, which is amazing. Another is the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. And Tillerson has been increasingly marginalized in the last couple of weeks precisely because of his hesitation about the expanding wars. So that's why I was saying what seems to be going on is that for all the Trump said in criticizing the war policies of Obama and Clinton, the people pushing those policies, call them the war party if you like, seems to have gotten their hands back on the levers of power, and Trump can fulminate as he wants, but the actual actions, both in Asia and in the Middle East, are in the direction of war and war provocations, as Karen was pointing out.
That may have been the plan behind the scenes to do that, because obviously...
he'd be a front? That Trump would be a...
Well, I don't know about that, but I do believe that obviously the military-industrial complex wanted to regain power, regain control, which
I don't think they ever lost it.
Which they assumed,
they never lost
which
it.
they assumed that they would get absolutely with Hillary. But with Trump, they were sort of like, okay, where's this guy going? They wasn't sure. Right. That's the reason that where's this fellow going? That's where I was. He showed promises in my eyes that he would change things. He would be a game changer. And that and I'm still optimistic.
That's what scared the neocons so much. That's why all the neocons fled the Republican Party and went to Hillary Clinton. They knew they could count on her to continue the war policies of the Obama administration, and they were suddenly afraid that if Trump was elected, he wouldn't continue those war policies.
So
the point is that Trump was elected, and he has continued the war policies.
I still question whether this is going to continue into the future.
Well, I hope you're right.
I'm still optimistic that there is something inside of Trump that will something inside of Trump, and then inside of this consciousness that will think outside the box, and that will reappear at some point in the future.
Well, your faith does you credit, and I hope you're right.
I truly.
I will make a couple comments on that.
Yes.
Well, one, I don't believe that the president, even though technically they have the power, I believe that it's the system or what we refer to as the power behind the throne that has the power. And it is the Pentagon, it is the National Security Administration, it is the CIA, it is the State Department, it is the Council on Foreign Relations, it is all of the corporate interest. And it's because capitalism is about profits, and we have a system of capitalism. So every time we think that, we're going to change our president, or we're going to change the administration with our two-party system, give me a break. The two-party system, and this actually includes domestic as well as foreign policy. Foreign policy, someone pointed out, actually continues on autopilot. Not exactly, because there's always a difference in strategy and tactics. Like, should we go after Iran and decimate them before we take on China? Or and I'm not joking, because I read it, this is true. Back about a year ago, there was an article related to some of the Pentagon telling Obama that his pivot to Asia was placing them in a precarious situation. So there are various different powers, and there are factions, and they don't always agree on tactics and strategy.
That's true.
But we march forward. And I'm sorry, but even our domestic policies, I'm sorry, I could never support Trump given his cabinet appointments were so obvious. But as most people who've been following politics very, very closely know, that we've been whittling away under the Democrats. Obama was just a much smoother evil than what Trump. Trump is transparent. You're absolutely right. He is very transparent. He smacks us right in the face with all of it. So, and the reason why I focus on this so much is because I think the people need to understand we need full regime change. And that does not just mean changing one party for another when we have a regime behind it. that is going to continue in this step. Now, I want to focus back to Asia. I think this is very important, and I'm actually going to read my own statement that I made this morning over my first cup of coffee. It's not unlike me to read from my own statement, but this is important. I've talked a lot about the Rohingya, the Muslims of Burma, and what I saw coming down the trail. Well, now we're there. And what I wrote this morning was that the military government of Burma, or Myanmar as it's now called, I say Burma still because I was a political activist in the 90s against the military government, in that I was supporting some of the exiles in various different capacities, primarily attempting to help them with their education and a safe house, etc.
If you say Myanmar, most people don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
You got to say Burma in order to make it clear.
And actually the name Myanmar, although it simply means Burma, it's not. It was chosen by the military government, which is why we resisted it at the time, because military government was an illegitimate government, because at that time Aung San Suu Kyi was the legitimately democratically elected president, okay? I think that was 1993 was the election, but I've forgotten.
But in a peculiar similarity to what we were just talking about in this country, she's thrown in her lot with the war party there, hasn't she?
Well, wait, no. She was put under house arrest for all those years, and now she's joined up with the war party, exactly. But here's my statement. The military government of Burma, Myanmar is a particularly ruthless and cruel one, make no mistake. It's still in power in spite of all appearances. They are behind the scenes. They began the slaughter of Rohingyas or Muslims on a very large scale approximately 2 to 4 years ago. It really became really obvious to the West in 2012. Now, a few months ago, news of the Saudis' training of the Rohingyas, as well as supplying them with weapons, U.S. weapons, to defend themselves, made the news. And Carl, you alerted me to that. It certainly began to look like another Syria. And now we have many human rights groups suddenly calling for international assistance to the Rohingyas. This would be good. We want international assistance, medical, food, first aid, etc. Housing, because they're just being pushed all over the planet and often right into the ocean. The question is, will the U.S. use this as an excuse for intervention? Is it because the government of Burma, Myanmar, just signed an agreement with China for a gas pipeline running through the nation and to the ports of Rakhine onto the Indian Ocean? Rakhine State is that area which is right on the Indian Ocean, and it would bypass the chokehold on the Malacca Straits with the potential now for the BRI, or the Belt Road Initiative, by China. Now, I think we know the answer. If the Burmese government doesn't cancel their agreements with China, where this is all headed. Now, back in 2014, because I took particular interest in the One Belt, One Road, because I honestly believed, I still do to this day, I have little support on this from Thais, but that the Thai military takeover occurred in 2014 in Thailand because the former president, Prime Minister Thaksin, gave the contract to build the One Belt, One Road through Thailand to China. And that, to the U.S. government, was an absolute no-no. And ever since that time, the U.S. and China and the Thai government, they've been playing back and forth, back and forth. The Thai government has, one minute as soon as the coup took place, they canceled. That was their first action, was to practically to cancel the railway agreement with China. And then they gave it back to them later on, and then they canceled it. So I think they're going ahead with it, but you never know, because the Chinese military government will be playing both sides as long as they just keep getting more and more money out of it, which is usually the way it is. But we have to keep in mind, even though the Thai military government is awful, and just like the Duarte government of the Philippines is awful in the way they treat their people, it's up to those people, it is up to those nations to handle their domestic issues. And I do believe that a lot of the Philippines, a lot of its propaganda regarding the propaganda that we have against him for killing people over drugs, the U.S. gave him the money to clean up the drug situation. And we know who is behind the drug wars in Mexico and the U.S. and Thailand and everywhere else. So one of the things I want to recommend to anyone who wants to know more about this is an article called "The Rohingya of Myanmar: Pawns in an Anglo-Chinese Proxy War Fought by Saudi Jihadists." This is written by Andrew Corbico, who is an American from my hometown, actually, and it's in Moon of Alabama. Now,
That's the website.
moonofalabama.com, yes. However, I have to warn you, when I went back in a second time to Moon of Alabama, it disappeared. I couldn't acquire it.
I think that's temporary. I was reading it this morning.
I hope. Well, I read it this morning too,
Oh,
and then it disappeared the second
Really?
time I went in,
Okay.
and then I started having a lot of problems with my laptop, and it's Google. I get that little Google sign giving me a hard time. So I hope
Putin
it's
Nazi
back
interference, undoubtedly. Huh?
there. No, it's not Putin. It's Google. Trust me. But the real issue here is this is another proxy war. Is the U.S. going to intervene? I think they already have with weapons and technology and training of the Rohingya so that they can create chaos.
Via the Saudis.
By the Saudis,
Yeah, yeah.
yes, but so they can create chaos.
Like Syria in some ways, eh?
Well, Syria, Libya, Kosovo, I mean, all of these nations that have been destroyed by the U.S. at some point or another. So I do recommend that article. I posted it on our Facebook page, Carl, and it's the best that I've come across as far as going into true detail dating back the Burmese history.
What's the article again? Wait, what is the name of the article?
Well, you go to the website moonofalabama.com,
Okay.
and the article is it was by Mr. Corbico.
Yeah.
He's on my Facebook.
Yeah.
There's even a map here. That whole area. Let me give you the title again. Okay, the Rohingya of Myanmar,
Okay.
pawns in an Anglo-Chinese proxy war fought by Saudi jihadists. And we know that now the jihadists are in the Philippines, in the south of the Philippines. They've linked up with some of the non-political terrorist organizations that were there. I don't know if they've linked up with the Moro group, who were actually simply, they wanted their independence. But this, I think, is because Duterte started moving closer to China. And I think that's the way the U.S. was like, okay, you're going to move closer to China?
We'll give you
We give you ISIS.
revolution.
We give you ISIL.
We give you ISIS, yes.
Yeah, and that means we'll give you Syria, literally. That's what it is. So
That's unfortunately, I'm afraid that's right, and we forget sometimes that the U.S. invented jihadism. By that we mean radical Islamic terrorism, and in spite of the massive blowback of 9/11, where the jihadism that we invented attacked New York and Washington, the fact of the matter is that all American administrations since the 1970s have been willing to use radical Islamic terrorists for its own purposes across the world, notably in Syria. It was invented for Afghanistan, and that all of these activities that the U.S. covertly supports or turns a blind eye to are in aid of that bedrock of American policy we were talking about earlier, preventing the economic integration of Asia, of Eurasia. This is what the U.S. is doing. This is why we're in Afghanistan. The notion we're in Afghanistan to stop terrorism is, of course, nonsense. The notion that we have spent billions of dollars in Afghanistan because that's where Osama bin Laden went at one point, that, of course, is nonsense. What's not nonsense about Afghanistan is that it is a thorn in the side, look at a map, of the Chinese-Russian alliance and the willingness to give Russia a Vietnam of its own, which was the original reason, according to your friend Zbigniew Brzezinski, for inventing jihadism.
I keep referring to him as my friend.
Because you've described his activities so clearly.
Yeah,
That's right.
he and Kissinger, those two.
The point here is that jihadism or terrorism or Islamic terrorism and so forth has been a dark partner of the United States long-term policy that you described earlier, that is screwing up Eurasian integration, economic integration. An economically integrated Eurasia is a threat to the world economic dominance of the American 1%. And as you pointed out, that's been seen since before the beginning of the 20th century. Some things don't change.
And when I have to
Go ahead.
one of the things that is brought out in this article, which I think is so important, is that people think that, okay, we're going to arm these poor people so they can defend themselves.
Defend themselves, right.
No, you're going to arm them so you can go in, use them as cannon fodder, or as the expression. In the meantime, the Burmese military is, in order to get even with anything they do, they'll burn a whole village. That means the families who didn't escape. And what will happen is the Rohingya will be destroyed totally as a people. Now, there's something like 500,000 of them, I found out. The article here refers to 500,000 of them, I think, in Pakistan, where they're being trained. And yet I saw a map that showed that there were 500,000 of them in Saudi Arabia. This goes back to the 70s, as the article explains. But there are only 5,000 in Thailand. And Thailand is a nation that has had thousands upon thousands of refugees flowing in from Burma, from Cambodia, from Vietnam, from Laos over the years, and yet we only have 5,000 people in Thailand. I say we because I lived there for 22 years. And that's very telling, and I think the Thais were actually killing them when their boats would arrive on the shores, any Muslims that would come aboard, and that's why they were actually bypassing Thailand when they were going by boat and going into Malaysia. But I don't know how many are in Malaysia right now, but Malaysia being a Muslim nation, they were in hopes of being taken care of there.
Want to get an oar in here?
No, it's okay.
You're watching Aware on the Air. We have a lot on our plates because we as Americans certainly do, and we're responsible for putting it there, I think, in many cases.
Yeah.
Another topic, Ed?
No, it's okay. I'll
go ahead.
let it say.
I've run out. I never run out, but I'm tired.
I was just going to mention perhaps the ridiculousness of the fake news issue, the creation by the media as if this was a new subject matter, and then obviously the concept of fake news goes all the way back. I mean, even one of the most famous films and movies of all time was based on the publisher of fake news, Citizen Kane.
Oh yes.
So we were going all the way back. So literally the issue,
Yeah.
and we're going back to the I guess the Spanish-American War, the sinking in the Maine and everything. But I'm saying, yeah. So the issue of fake news goes back before my grandparents were still in their diapers. So it's pretty much an old issue.
I think that's a very good point. It seems to me that the biggest problem with fake news is not the morning paper, but the history book. The fake news that does the great danger is this account, you mentioned it earlier in regard to Korea.
Fake news becomes fact.
This account we have of American policy going back to time immemorial. The notion that the U.S. is out there defending the world against fascists and terrorists and communists and all sorts of nasty people and spreading peace and
the Gulf of Tonkin becomes a reality in Vietnam War. Yes.
Well, but it's an interesting example.
Yeah.
The notion that the U.S. Was engaged in a war in Vietnam, which predates, in fact, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, for peaceful reasons, to stop communism, to defend South Vietnam.
Domino effect, yeah.
These things are nonsense.
Yeah.
But if we look at U.S. policy in general, the U.S. policy in the Pacific after the Second World War, we understand how important it was for the United States to maintain, as Karen mentioned earlier, this sort of economic control of Southeast Asia.
Or control of energy, yeah.
It was the war was about the Japanese Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere and the conflict between Japan and the United States.
Yeah.
The U.S. destroyed Japan and inherited the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which redounded to the profits of the American 1%. It was not about to have any local colonial people say, we're not going to be part of that. We're going to do our own economic development outside of what you are doing. doing, you, the United States, is doing in the world at large. That's what the Vietnamese Revolution, the Vietnamese anti-colonial revolution said after the Second World War, and the U.S. said, no, you don't. You can't do that. First of all, the colonial power was reinserted, that is France, and the U.S. even offered to use nuclear weapons at one point or considered using nuclear weapons to defend the French position in Vietnam against the domestic revolution. So these things have a history. There's a line of purpose here on the part of the United States that people don't know about.
Well, I was going to mention that fake news, or the whole concept of we were spreading democracy, and then when in reality, with the other conflicts with the control of the African minerals,
exactly,
and also control of the energy in the Middle East, and
yes.
so that was the real reason why certain wars were manufactured. If you use your friend of yours, but I mean,
and your hero Donald Trump. Pardon me.
I'm not.
No, I'm
yeah, I understand. Yes,
being purposely provocative because said some of this during the campaign.
Yeah,
and he pointed out the wars from Iraq through Afghanistan are things that we should not be doing. Now that was quite remarkable.
Yeah.
He's changed his tune. We can talk why, psychologically, why, in fact, the Trump administration is now in the hands of the military officers you were mentioning
I'm still
earlier.
Optimistic.
You're still optimistic?
Can I intervene?
Yeah,
I'm really sorry. I have to tell you this, guys, because I know many significant people. I watch RT. A lot of really significant people that I respect were hopeful about Trump. I saw a Paul J. broadcast, and I can't tell you which one, but it was a long one, and he actually showed a clipping of Donald Trump, and it was in 2011. I think it was CNN, but maybe it was Fox. I'm not sure. But when I actually saw Donald Trump urging intervention on Libya, and that we had to go into Libya because Gaddafi was so evil and he was killing thousands and thousands of people. It was a typical U.S. propaganda that we've actually criticized people like
Hillary Clinton.
Well, we know Hillary Clinton said that, but we've actually had some problems with democracy now because I didn't know it at the time, but because Amy Goodman was actually promoting some of the propaganda against Libya at the time, which turned out to be completely wrong. But Trump was doing the exact same thing. So I think we do have to have some caution there. I mean, find it if you can. Something else I do want to bring up.
No, we got to stop.
Okay.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 36th week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by the U.S. worldwide war-making. Our thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Andrew Scollery. Thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware for articles we've referred to tonight. There's an announcement. The Russian Revolution is the Mirror of Third World Aspirations is the title of a talk to be given by Vijay Prashad at the night audit at Spurlock Museum tomorrow night at 7:30 p.m. Recommend that.
And
Finally,
a teach-in on the 23rd at Channing Murray with a panelist of 9 people, including
23rd of September,
including
we will talk
yours
about that.
Truly, Carl Estabrook.
We'll talk about that in the future. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others. Truth tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. This is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ed Mendel, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, David Johnson, maybe, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.